Welcome to The Explainer. Now, the October 7th attack has been picked apart from just about every angle you can think of. Intelligence failures, tactical mistakes, you name it. But what if the real story, the one that truly explains how we got here, didn't start a few months ago, or even a few years ago, but decades earlier? In this explainer, we're diving into a source article that makes a really provocative case, that the seeds for that day were planted by three key decisions made over the last 30 years. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at why the author says we need to look beyond the immediate failures. Then we're going to deconstruct their argument piece by piece, starting with the consequences of the Oslo Accords, the ripple effect from the Lebanon withdrawal, and what the source calls the declaration made by the Gaza disengagement. And finally, we'll get into what the author sees as the ideological crisis behind it all, and the three big lessons they think need to be learned. All right, let's jump into our first section, Beyond Immediate Failures. You know, most of the analysis you see is focused on the months right before October 7th. But the author of our source material says that's like looking through the wrong end of a telescope. To really get the why, they argue, you have to zoom way, way out. And that really brings us to the absolute core question of this entire argument. What if this wasn't just a failure of intelligence in 2023, but the final terrible results of a long, slow, strategic decay? The source basically argues that what happened wasn't a sudden storm. It was a hurricane that had been building strength way out at sea for an entire generation. So here's the thesis in a nutshell. It all rests on three pillars: the Oslo Accords in the 90s, the withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000, and the disengagement from Gaza in 2005. The argument is that each of these decisions, in its own way, chipped away at Israel's power to deter its enemies, emboldened them, and ultimately, the author says, drew a direct line to the horrors we saw unfold. All right, let's tackle that first big event, the Oslo Accords. Now, for so many people, this was a time of unbelievable hope, a real shot at peace. But the author argues it was a major turning point that had what they describe as just devastating, long-term consequences that we often don't talk about. I mean, listen to this quote from Shimon Peres back in '94. It just perfectly captures the incredible optimism of that moment. It really felt like a new era was beginning. But according to the source we're looking at, this hope was actually masking a series of what the author calls fundamental, even fatal miscalculations. So the author breaks down their critique into four key areas. First, security, arguing that handing over cities created safe havens for terror groups. Politically, it legitimized the PLO on the world stage. Ideologically, it sent a message of weakening resolve. But the one the author really emphasizes is the impact of education. This is a massive part of the author's case. The claim is that by giving up control of the Palestinian education system, Israel basically allowed a curriculum to be built that glorified martyrdom and demonized Jews, raising an entire generation capable of committing the kinds of atrocities seen on October 7th. And the author then points to this recorded phone call as the brutal, real-world result of that indoctrination. This call, cited in the source, is just chilling. It's a son, so proud, telling his dad about the people he just murdered, and it's presented as the ultimate proof of the author's argument about education. But it wasn't just education. The author also points to money, to financial incentives. This chart, based on figures from the source, shows that a pretty big slice of the Palestinian Authority's budget, about 7%, goes to what's often called pay for slay. These are payments made to terrorists in prison and to the families of those killed carrying out attacks. And the numbers the author cites are pretty stark. A terrorist serving a long-term sentence, say over 30 years, can apparently get a monthly salary of 12,000 shekels from the PA. Now, to put that in perspective, the source points out that's about 4 times the average salary there. So in the author's view, this isn't just some side program. It's a state-sponsored system that actually institutionalizes and rewards terrorism. Okay, let's move on to the second major decision in the author's thesis, the withdrawal from Lebanon back in 2000. This isn't framed as just a smart, pragmatic choice. No, it's presented as a critical moment that fundamentally changed how Israel's enemies saw its strength and its will to fight. Now, this timeline gives you the context that the source provides. The argument is that the withdrawal didn't just happen in a vacuum. You had this string of really traumatic military disasters in the late 90s. The helicopter crash, the Shayet 13 ambush, that created this huge public pressure campaign in Israel to just get out. And here is how the author claims Israel's enemies read that withdrawal. Just a couple of days later, Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah gives his famous spider's web speech. The source presents this as the exact moment a new narrative was born, that Israel, despite all its tanks and planes, had lost its nerve and could actually be broken by enough violent pressure. And according to the source, the impact was immediate and measurable. Polls cited from that time apparently showed that 63% of Palestinians now believe that Hezbollah's way, armed struggle, was the right path. So in the author's view, the withdrawal wasn't seen as a peace gesture at all, but as proof that violence gets results. And the source then notes that just 4 months later, the Second Intifada exploded. Okay, this brings us to the third and final decision, the 2005 Gaza disengagement. The author argues that if the Lebanon withdrawal was a crack in the dam of Israeli deterrence, the Gaza disengagement was the moment the entire dam just burst. Now, the source makes a really crucial distinction here. Leaving Lebanon, they argue, was about abandoning a temporary security zone. But the Gaza disengagement, that involved uprooting thousands of Israeli citizens from established homes, from what they considered parts of their homeland. So in the author's view, it wasn't seen as a tactical move, but as a deep, strategic declaration of weakness, a surrender of land in the face of terrorism. And to prove the point, the author points to statements just like this one to show how Hamas saw the whole thing. This quote is from their military commander, Mohammed Deif, and it's pretty unambiguous. He saw Gaza not as the end of the conflict, but as step one, a playbook for how to take the rest of the land. The author argues the withdrawal was basically a green light. So the big question is, if these decisions were so damaging, why on earth were they made? In this section, the author shifts from the what to the why and argues that the real root cause wasn't just bad strategy, but a much deeper ideological crisis brewing inside parts of Israeli society itself. This quote here is from Ron Pundek, one of the architects of the Oslo Accords. And notice how he frames it. He's quoted here saying, "Peace is a way to make Israel a normal state, to move away from what he calls its Judaization." The source presents this as Exhibit A in a case that some Israeli elites simply wanted to shed the heavy burdens of Jewish history and nationalism. And to show this sentiment wasn't just political, the author includes this quote from the writer Dorit Rabinyan, describing this deep desire to shed the heavy coat of nationalism and just become a citizen of the world. The author we're covering argues that this yearning for normalcy, as they call it, created a kind of strategic blindness, a failure to see that their enemies had absolutely no interest in becoming normal. So after laying out this whole 30-year history of what they see as a chain of strategic blunders, the author wraps everything up by drawing 3 very stark lessons they believe are absolutely essential for Israel's survival. So let's just walk through them. First, the argument goes, national strength has to start with a strong, unapologetic Zionist and Jewish identity. Second, the policy of giving up land for what turns out to be a temporary quiet is a total failure. In the author's view, withdrawals just invite more war. And third, a lesson as old as the country itself, security and settlement go hand in hand. You can't have security without a strong civilian presence on the land. We'll end on this final quote from all the way back in 1936, which the author uses to frame their ultimate conclusion. It asks the question, until when? How long must we fight? And it provides a totally uncompromising answer. Until Israel's strength is so absolute, so undeniable, that even its most passionate enemies know for a fact there is simply no way to break it. It's a tough perspective, and it's where the author leaves us, arguing that the only true path to survival lies not in compromise, but in overwhelming, unquestioned power.